The ring hit the floorboards of the Kendrick General Store with a sound so small it should not have mattered at all, and yet it stopped every breath in Rebecca Kendrick's chest, as though someone had reached inside her ribs and squeezed her heart with a fist made of ice. Joel Dalton stood across the counter from her, his hat in one hand and a small brass ring pinched between the thumb and forefinger of his other hand, his jaw set in that familiar tight line she had come to know over the past 8 months. He had not gone down on one knee. He had not said anything that resembled the words she had always imagined hearing. He had simply placed the ring on the wooden counter between a jar of horehound candy and a spool of brown thread, slid it toward her the way a man slides coins across a bar top, and said, flat as the Kansas plains outside the door, "I reckon we ought to get married." Rebecca stared at the ring. She stared at him. The afternoon light came through the dusty window behind her in long golden bars and made him look like something carved out of the earth itself, all sun-darkened skin and jaw and shoulder, and she felt the full force of her own longing rise up and crash into the full force of her own fury, and the combination of the two was something she had never felt before in all her 26 years. "You reckon," she said. "That is what I said. Joel Dalton." She kept her voice very quiet. The quieter she kept it, the more dangerous she knew it sounded, and she wanted it to be dangerous right now. She wanted every syllable to carry the weight of the 8 months she had spent wondering and waiting, and telling herself she was foolish for wondering and waiting. "That is the worst proposal I have ever heard in my entire life." Something flickered behind his dark eyes, something that might have been wounded pride or confusion or the faintest shadow of panic. "It is a ring," he said. "I am asking you to be my wife." "You are informing me," she said, "that you reckon we ought to." There is a difference between asking and informing, and there is an even larger difference between asking and proposing, and I will not be proposed to like a land deal, Joel. I will not. She picked the ring up off the counter and placed it back in his open palm. She closed his fingers around it gently. She held his closed fist in both her hands for just a moment longer than was strictly necessary, long enough that she felt the warmth of his skin and hated herself for noticing it, and then she let go. "Try again," she said, "when you know what you actually want to say." And that was how everything truly began. To understand why those words hit Joel Dalton the way they did, why he walked out of that general store and stood on the main street of Harrow Creek, Kansas, in the blazing September heat of 1882, feeling as though the ground beneath his boots had become something uncertain, you had to go back 8 months, to January, when the hardest winter in a decade had driven Rebecca Kendrick into his life like a nail into seasoned wood. Harrow Creek was not a large town. It sat on a flat stretch of land along Barker's Creek in the southwestern corner of Kansas, and it had been there long enough to have a proper main street with a livery stable, a barber shop, a hotel of modest ambition called the Whitmore House, a saloon called the Red Door, a church, a bank, and the Kendrick General Store, which had been established by Rebecca's father, Thomas Kendrick, in 1871, and which Rebecca had been running alone since Thomas had passed in the spring of 1881. 16 months before the morning, she corrected Joel Dalton's proposal and sent him out into the September heat to think about what he actually wanted to say. Joel had arrived in Harrow Creek 3 years before Rebecca made him leave that store. He had come from further south, out of Texas, trailing a history he did not speak about to anyone and a reputation as a man who could manage cattle the way some men managed their own breathing, which was to say naturally and without visible effort. He had hired on with the Callahan Ranch, which was the largest operation within 20 miles of Harrow Creek, and he had earned the position of foreman inside his first year, which told you everything you needed to know about the kind of man Joel Dalton was if you were the sort of person who paid attention to how men worked. He was 30 years old in 1882. He had never been married. He had, as it turned out, never proposed to anyone in his life, a fact that was somewhat embarrassing for a man of his apparent confidence, but which made complete and logical sense once you understood his history, which Rebecca did not understand in January of 1882, when they first spoke in any real way. She had been at the store on a Tuesday morning, a gray and bitter January Tuesday, and the temperature had been cold enough that even the inside of the store felt like breathing through cloth. The stove in the corner had been doing its best, but the best it could manage was inadequate, and Rebecca had been wearing her wool coat indoors and counting the morning's modest receipts when the door opened and let in a wall of cold air and Joel Dalton. He had come in for oats, which was an unremarkable errand, and she had pulled on the heavy canvas sack from the back shelf and heaved it onto the counter. And when she turned around, she had found him looking at the shelf behind her, the one where she kept the medicines and the liniment, and his face had held an expression she recognized because she had worn something like it herself in the months after her father died. It was the expression of someone who was doing fine as long as they were in motion and in public, and who only let the real weight of something show when they thought no one was paying attention. She had not said anything about it. She had charged him for the oats and he had carried them out, and that would have been the end of it except that he came back the following Friday, and the Friday after that, and it became apparent after the fourth or fifth Friday that he did not always need what he came in to buy, and that he tended to come in during the quieter hours of the afternoon when she was alone behind the counter, and that he had begun to talk to her. Not about anything large or significant, about the weather, about the condition of the road between town and the ranch, about whether she thought the winter wheat would come in well. Small talk, frontier talk, the kind of words that fill space between people who are not yet ready to say the things that matter. But she had listened carefully, the way she always listened, and she had understood that the small talk was a kind of reconnaissance, that he was learning the territory of her, testing the ground between them before committing his weight to it. She had found herself looking forward to the Fridays. She had told herself it was simply the pleasant distraction of company, that the store was lonely in winter, and any friendly face was welcome. She had told herself this lie with considerable conviction right up until the afternoon in March when he had come in out of a sudden hard rain, soaked to the skin and laughing at himself, and she had handed him a dry cloth from the shelf behind her, and their hands had touched in the passing of it, and her heart had done something it had absolutely no business doing. By April she knew she was in serious trouble. By May the whole town of Harrow Creek had noticed that Joel Dalton spent a significant portion of his Fridays at the general store, when the apparent purpose of his errand could have been accomplished in under 10 minutes. By June, Margaret Whitmore, who ran the hotel and was the undisputed clearinghouse of Harrow Creek's social intelligence, had told Rebecca directly over a cup of coffee that if something was going to happen, it ought to happen soon, because there was no virtue in dragging out the obvious indefinitely. Rebecca had thanked her and changed the subject, because the truth was more complicated than Margaret knew. The truth was that Joel Dalton, for all his Friday visits and his lingering conversations, and the way he had looked at her with those dark, careful eyes, had never said anything that crossed the line from friendly into something more. He had never said anything that could be taken as declaration. He had never reached across the counter and taken her hand or told her she was beautiful or any of the things a man ought to say when he meant what she believed he meant. And Rebecca had a particular problem with secrets. She had a particular problem with things that were hidden, with dark pasts and buried truths, because she had lived through one already in a way that had cost her more than she liked to think about. His name had been Arthur Prentice. He had come through Harrow Creek in the summer of 1879, when Rebecca was 23 and her father was still alive, and the store was thriving, and Arthur had been charming and handsome and full of stories about his family's land holdings back east, and he had courted Rebecca with an energy and attention that had felt overwhelming and wonderful. And she had let herself be swept up in it because she had been young and lonely and entirely unprepared for the kind of man who uses a woman's longing as a trap. The betrayal, when it came, had been of the specific kind that leaves a scar you cannot see but can always feel. Arthur Prentice had not been who he said he was. He had not had family land holdings in the East. He had had a wife in St. Louis, a fact that had emerged with the brutal simplicity of the truth when Mrs. Arthur Prentice had appeared in Harrow Creek on a stage from Dodge City in the October of 1879, looking for her missing husband. Rebecca had found out the way you find out the worst things, which is suddenly and in public, and the humiliation had been a particular shade of dark that she carried quietly for years afterward. So she was not someone who trusted easily. She was not someone who let herself believe in the obvious before she had evidence, before she had seen the truth of a man's heart confirmed by his actual words and actual choices. She had watched Joel Dalton across the counter of her store for 8 months, and she had let herself feel what she felt, and she had not let herself act on it, because she had learned at great cost what happened when you let your hope run faster than your wisdom. And then came September and his ring on the counter and his, "I reckon we ought to get married." And the strange and complicated truth of the matter was that hearing him say it wrong had confirmed something she had not been sure of until that exact moment. A man does not propose badly to a woman he does not care about. A man does not show up with a ring and stand in the dusty light of a general store with his hat in his hand and his jaw tight and his whole body radiating the particular kind of tension that belongs only to men who are terrified of something, unless he actually means it, unless it matters to him in a way that has tied his usual competence into a knot. She had seen all of that. She had felt all of that. And she had told him to try again because she believed, with everything she had in her, that he was capable of getting it right, and because she refused to accept a proposal that had been delivered like a business arrangement, and because some part of her wanted to give him the chance to say the real thing, the true thing, the thing that was clearly living inside him and had simply come out wrong. She was not wrong about any of it. But she did not know, in September, how much she was going to have to trust that belief before it was tested nearly beyond its limits. Joel Dalton walked back to the Callahan ranch in a state of internal disorder that was entirely foreign to him. He had built his adult life on the principle of clear-eyed practicality. You assessed a situation. You identified the best available course of action. You executed it without excess deliberation or emotional interference. It was the principle that had made him a good cowhand, an excellent foreman, a man other men trusted when the situation required someone to make a decision fast and stand behind it. It had never worked particularly well in his personal life, but he had not had much personal life to worry about, so the failure had been largely theoretical until Rebecca Kendrick put a ring back in his hand and told him he was doing it wrong. He had bought that ring in Dodge City. He had ridden the 60 miles there and back over 2 days in August, which was the kind of thing a man does when he has finally decided to stop being a coward about something. He had picked the ring out himself in a jewelry shop on Front Street, a small gold band with a single garnet, because garnets were red and red was the color of the dress she had worn to the church social in July, and the sight of her in that dress had been the thing that had finally tipped him from prolonged and agonized certainty into the decision to act. He had the ring. He had the decision. What he had not had, apparently, was the words. The problem was the dark past he was carrying, the thing he had never told Rebecca, the thing that had calcified somewhere between his chest and his throat every time he had opened his mouth to say something real in 8 months of Friday afternoons. It was not a betrayal, exactly. It was not a hidden wife or a con or anything of the specific variety that had wounded Rebecca before, though he did not know about Arthur Prentice yet. It was a grief, a buried and particular grief, that had become so much a part of the architecture of his interior life that he did not know how to expose it without feeling as though he was handing someone the ability to damage him completely. Her name had been Catherine. She had been the daughter of the rancher Joel had worked for in Texas, the one he had come to Harrow Creek to put distance between himself and. Not because anything scandalous or criminal had happened, but because Catherine had died. She had died of fever in the spring of 1879, 3 weeks before what was supposed to have been their wedding, and the grief of it had been the kind that does not resolve. It simply changes shape over time. And for 3 years Joel had managed it by working hard and moving steadily north, and keeping the carefully maintained distance from anyone who might require him to be vulnerable again. And then Rebecca Kendrick had handed him a dry cloth in the rain, and his hand had touched hers, and he had understood with the particular helplessness of a man whose best defenses have just been defeated that he was in serious trouble. He spent 2 days after the failed proposal riding the range and doing nothing useful and trying to construct what he should have said. He talked to his horse about it, which helped no one. He talked to himself at length during the long night watch and concluded that the problem was not knowing the right words, because the right words were actually quite simple, and he knew what they were. The problem was that saying them would require him to say the true thing first, the hidden thing, the thing about Catherine, and he was not at all sure how to begin. On the third day, a Thursday, he rode into Harrow Creek in the late afternoon. Rebecca was at the back of the store when she heard the door. She had been reorganizing the dry goods shelf, which did not need reorganizing, but which gave her hands something to do while the rest of her worked through the ongoing argument she was having with herself about whether she had done the right thing or whether she had been proud and foolish, and ruined the best thing that had happened to her in years. She turned around. Joel stood just inside the door. He had not taken his hat off yet. His expression was one she could not immediately read, which was unusual because she had become a close student of his expressions over the past 8 months. "I need to tell you something," he said, "before I try again, and I need you to hear it first." She put down the tin of baking powder she had been holding and came around the counter and leaned against it, facing him, and said, "All right." He took his hat off then. He held it in both hands, turning the brim slowly, and she watched him organize something interior, watched him find the start of the thing he needed to say. "I was engaged once before," he said, "in Texas. Her name was Catherine Marsh. She died of fever in the spring of 1879, before we were married. And I have not spoken about her to anyone since I left Texas. And I came north partly to put the distance between me and every place that reminded me of her. And I have spent the better part of 3 years being very careful not to want anything again, because wanting something the way I wanted that future, and then watching it be taken, is the kind of thing that changes a man's understanding of what he is willing to risk." The store was very quiet. Outside, someone's horse moved on the street, and a wagon creaked in the distance. The late afternoon light was coming through the window and laying itself over his face, and she could see the cost of what he was saying written in the lines around his eyes. "I am telling you this," he said, "because when I walked in here on Tuesday and put that ring on the counter and said what I said, I was doing it the way a man does something he is afraid of, which is fast and without the real words, so that if it goes wrong you can pretend you did not mean as much as you meant. And you were right to send me away. You were right to call it what it was." He stopped turning the hat. He looked at her directly. "And I am done being afraid of meaning as much as I mean." Rebecca felt the thing in her chest that she had been trying not to feel for 8 months, the full, undisguised weight of it, and she did not look away from him. "I did not know about Catherine," she said. "I am sorry about Catherine. I know you did not know. I am telling you now because you deserve to know the full truth of who you are dealing with before you make any decision. And because I think you have been afraid too, and I do not know exactly what you are afraid of, but I know that whatever it is making you careful the same way I have been careful, and I thought perhaps it would be easier if we both knew we were doing the same thing." He was not wrong. She felt the accuracy of it the way you feel the accuracy of something that has named a true thing about you. "Arthur Prentice," she said. "He came through here in 1879. He told me he was going to marry me, and he already had a wife in St. Louis. He was the kind of man who uses a woman's hope as a convenience, and I trusted him completely. And when I found out the truth, it was in public and it was from his wife. And I have been very careful ever since about believing in the obvious before I have proof of it. That is a particular kind of betrayal, Joel said. The kind that makes you distrust your own judgment. I understand it. Yes, she said. I think you do. They stood in the quiet of the store, and between them was the full truth of both of them now, the dark pasts and the hidden grief and the careful fortifications they had each built against further damage. And it was a strange and enormous relief to have it all visible, laid out in the late afternoon light between the jars of horehound candy and the spools of thread. "Rebecca," he said. He put his hat down on the counter beside him, which freed both his hands, and he reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced the ring. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at her. "I am not good at the poetic kind of talking. I do not know how to say things the way they say them in books. But I know what I feel, and I have known it for months, and I am done pretending I do not." He came around to her side of the counter. He was close enough now that she could have reached out and touched the front of his jacket without extending her arm all the way. He was not on one knee, not yet, but she could see him deliberating about it, could see him calculating whether it was the right thing to do, and she watched him decide that it was. And she watched him lower himself onto one knee on the floorboards of her general store, and the sight of it undid something in her chest that she had not known was still held in tension. "I would like to spend the rest of my life coming into this store and having you talk to me," he said. "I would like to know all the things you are careful about saying, and I would like to earn the right to hear them. I would like to be the man you trust when things are hard, because I think I could be that man if you gave me the chance to try. And I am asking you, Rebecca. I am asking, not informing. Will you marry me?" She looked at him on one knee on her floor, holding a small garnet ring, and she thought about Catherine Marsh and Arthur Prentice, and the particular way that grief and betrayal can make two people build identical walls by entirely different architectural methods. And she thought about 8 months of Fridays and the dry cloth in the rain and the red dress at the church social, and the way her heart had never learned to be sensible about this specific man, no matter how firmly she had instructed it. "Yes," she said, "that is a very great deal better, yes." He stood up. He put the ring on her finger. It fit, which she thought was remarkable, and when she asked him about it later, he admitted with considerable embarrassment that he had asked Margaret Whitmore for her ring size on the grounds that Margaret knew every relevant fact about every person in Harrow Creek, which was true and which delighted her completely. He kissed her for the first time there in the store, a careful and deliberate kiss that was nonetheless not tentative at all, a kiss that said clearly, "This is something I have meant for a long time," and she kissed him back with the same honest intention. Outside, the sun was going down over the Kansas plains in spectacular indifference to the significance of what had just happened inside, painting the sky in shades of copper and red. And Rebecca Kendrick stood in her store with a garnet ring on her finger and thought that she had been right to make him try again. The announcement of the engagement traveled through Harrow Creek at the speed that all significant news travels in small towns, which is to say instantly. And by the following morning, Margaret Whitmore had expressed her approval to approximately everyone she encountered, and Reverend Calkins at the church had smiled and said he had been expecting this for some time, and even the cowboys at the Callahan Ranch, who were not generally given to the discussion of romantic matters, had expressed their collective view that it was about time Joel stopped mooning over the general store woman and did something about it. Joel took the news of his transparent mooning with reasonable dignity. He had suspected that his Fridays had not gone unnoticed, but he had been comforting himself with the idea that cowboys were not observant about things that did not involve cattle. He was disabused of this idea thoroughly when Tom Callahan, who was 60 and had built his ranch from raw Kansas ground and who was not a sentimental man, came to find Joel in the south pasture and shook his hand and said that Rebecca Kendrick was a good woman and a smart one, and that he hoped Joel understood he had done well. Joel said he understood that very well. The weeks after the engagement were some of the best weeks of Joel's adult life, and he knew it even as he was living them, which was a rare and particular kind of happiness. He came into town more often now, not just on Fridays, and he helped Rebecca with things in the store, carrying the heavy stock from the back room and fixing the sticking hinge on the front door that she had been meaning to address for months, and building her a new shelf for the back wall that she had told him she needed in the same breath that she told him she had perfectly well managed without it until now. He understood that the managing without was not the point. The point was the building together. He was learning her. She was letting him. She was sharper than anyone had credited, which was something that annoyed her considerably. She kept a meticulous account of the store's finances in a leather-bound ledger that her father had started and that she had continued, and her arithmetic was faultless, and she had a memory for what her customers needed that was nothing short of extraordinary. She knew that the Waverly family out on the East Road went through twice as much coffee as comparable families, because the Waverly children were numerous and grew up fast and transitioned to coffee earlier than most parents approved of. She knew that old Silas Booker, who came in every first Monday of the month, needed his cornmeal measured to the half-pound because his teeth had been bothering him, and he had shifted to cornmeal porridge as his primary sustenance. She knew all of this and held all of it with a quiet attention that was, Joel thought, one of the most remarkable things about her. He told her this one evening in late October when they had closed the store and were sitting on the front porch steps in the cool autumn air, and she looked at him sideways with an expression that was half pleased and half something else. "My father taught me that knowing what people need is the most useful thing a shopkeeper can do," she said. "He said a store is not just a place where goods are exchanged. It is a place where people are taken care of. He sounds like he was a good man. He was the best man I knew," she said. "Until recently." She said the last part simply, without performance, as a plain statement of fact, and Joel felt it hit somewhere deep in his chest with a weight that was not entirely comfortable. Being trusted with that kind of esteem, after 3 years of keeping everyone at a careful distance, felt like standing in an open field after a long time in shelter. Exposed. Significant. "I'm going to try not to disappoint that," he said. "I know you are," she said. "That is why I said it." November came in cold and the wedding was set for the second Saturday of December, which gave them a few weeks to prepare and gave Harrow Creek a few weeks to involve itself in the preparation to the degree that small towns always involve themselves in occasions that belong to people they have decided to claim as their own. Margaret Whitmore organized a gathering of the women of the town to produce a wedding quilt, which Rebecca accepted with genuine gratitude and only minor protestations about the trouble it caused. Reverend Calkins began composing what Joel privately suspected would be a lengthy address on the subject of providence and companionship. Tom Callahan announced that the Callahan Ranch would provide the beef for the wedding dinner, which was a significant gift and was received as such. Joel rode to Dodge City again, this time to purchase material for a new suit, because the suit he owned was adequate for church on Christmas and Easter, but he had decided that he wanted to stand next to Rebecca on their wedding day in something that reflected the seriousness of what he was doing. The tailor in Dodge City, a precise little man named Mr. Gruber, had looked him over and said that charcoal gray would suit a man of his coloring, and Joel had agreed, and the suit had been ordered, and he had ridden home in the November wind feeling something he could only describe as impatience, which was not a feeling he was accustomed to, but which he found he did not mind. It was in the second week of November, when the plains had turned brown and the mornings were hard with frost, that the first trouble arrived, and its name was Dale Reeves. Dale Reeves had come into Harrow Creek in October, which was after the engagement and before Joel had ridden for his suit, and he had taken a room at the Whitmore house, and he had presented himself as a buyer, a man looking for good land in the area for a projected ranching operation, which was a legitimate enough reason to be in the territory, and which had given him access to the normal courtesies of a small town without raising any particular alarm. He was 34, a lean and well-spoken man with a way of making himself pleasant to everyone he met, and he had discovered the Kendrick General Store in his first week in town and had become a regular customer in a way that Joel noticed and did not particularly like. He came in most mornings. He lingered. He talked to Rebecca with an attention that was specific and unmistakable, and Rebecca, who was inherently courteous to her customers, was courteous to him, and Joel watched this with a cold and controlled discomfort that he did not show in public, because he was not the kind of man who showed that kind of thing in public. But the trouble with Dale Reeves was not the lingering, and it was not the attention. The trouble with Dale Reeves was what Joel discovered on a cold Thursday in November when he rode into town to pick up a delivery of wire for the ranch and stopped in at the store and found that Rebecca was not behind the counter. She was in the back room. He could hear her talking, low and with an edge in her voice that he had not heard before. He went around the counter without hesitating, a thing he would not have done 2 months ago, and knocked on the back room door and opened it. Dale Reeves was standing in the back room. He was standing too close to Rebecca for a simple conversation, and his expression when he turned and saw Joel was not the expression of a man who has been caught doing nothing. It was the expression of a man who has been interrupted. "Dalton," he said. He was calm about it. That particular calmness was its own kind of provocation. "Reeves," Joel said. He looked at Rebecca. "Everything all right?" "Fine," she said. She looked at Reeves with the cool and direct regard that Joel had come to recognize as her version of controlled anger. "Mr. Reeves was just leaving." Reeves looked at Joel for a moment, making a private calculation that was visible in his eyes even if nothing was visible on his face, and then he smiled pleasantly and moved toward the door. "Of course," he said. "Good day, Miss Kendrick, Dalton," and he went. Rebecca stood for a moment after the sound of the front door reached them, and then she sat down on the barrel of crackers beside the shelf of dry goods and put her hands in her lap and looked at them. "He is not who he says he is," she said. Joel leaned in the doorway. "Tell me. He is not looking for land, or if he is, that is not the primary reason he is here." She looked up. "He came in last week and he asked me questions about the store, about my father, about who holds the note on the building. He was interested in the property, Joel, but not the way a man is interested in land he wants to buy near here. He was interested in this specific property." Joel understood this in the space of a breath. "What does he want with the store?" "I do not know exactly. But this morning he came in and he said something that he intended to be pleasant, the way he intends everything to be pleasant. And what it amounted to was an intimation that a woman running a business alone was a kind of difficulty that could be resolved in various ways." She paused. "He said he had contacts in Dodge City who dealt in commercial properties. He said that he thought there might be a time coming when a sale would be advantageous." The cold clarity of what Reeves was doing settled over Joel like the frost. It was a particular kind of predation, the kind practiced by men who identify a woman running a business without a male partner as a target, who apply the slow pressure of suggestion and threat disguised as concern, until the target becomes convinced that selling is the reasonable choice. Rebecca had no mortgage on the building. Her father had built it free and clear, and she owned it outright. But a store could be undermined in other ways, and a woman alone was more vulnerable to certain kinds of interference than a woman with a husband. "Did he make an offer?" Joel asked. "Not yet. It was too early for that. He was just beginning." "He will not get the chance to advance it," Joel said. "I will speak to him." "Joel," her voice had the tone he had learned to recognize as the precursor to a direct and careful correction of his assumptions. "You will not speak to him on my behalf as though this is your problem to manage. This is my store and my situation, and I am handling it. What I am telling you is so that you know, not so that you can take it over." He stopped. He breathed. He recognized the justice of this. "All right," he said. "How are you handling it?" "I'm going to speak to Mr. Callahan," she said. "He carries more weight in this area than anyone, and if he makes clear to Reeves that this particular property and this particular woman are not available for any of his schemes, Reeves will recalculate the situation and move on. Men like Reeves are fundamentally practical. They do not persist when the environment is not favorable." Joel thought about this. It was a better strategy than confrontation, which was what he had intended, and which would have been more satisfying but less effective. "You have thought this through," he said. "I have been thinking about men like Dale Reeves since I was 23 years old," she said. "I recognize the species." She went to see Tom Callahan the following day, and she made her case to him with the directness and clarity that characterized everything she did when she had decided a thing needed doing. And Tom Callahan listened with the careful attention of a man who has been building something for 30 years and knows the difference between real threats and imagined ones. By the end of the conversation, he had agreed to have a word with Reeves, and the word he had consisted of the plain information that the Kendrick store was a protected commercial interest in Harrow Creek, that Rebecca Kendrick was soon to be the wife of his foreman, and that anyone with designs on the property or the proprietor would find the territory inhospitable. Reeves left Harrow Creek the following week. Joel said nothing about the satisfaction he felt at this. Rebecca said nothing about it either, but she squeezed his hand when she told him Reeves was gone, and the warmth of it stayed with him for the rest of the day. December arrived with a particular and gorgeous severity. The plains went white under the first heavy snowfall of the season, and the sky over Harrow Creek turned that deep and extraordinary blue that only happens in winter over the central plains of the country. And the town put up Christmas greens along the storefronts, and Reverend Calkins's church had been decorated with pine boughs and red ribbon. And the whole world seemed to be cooperating with the occasion of Joel Dalton and Rebecca Kendrick's wedding in a way that even the most cautious and pragmatic of them could not entirely dismiss. The wedding was on the 13th of December, 1882, a Saturday, and it was cold and clear and still, the kind of winter morning that is so sharp and bright it feels like the world has been newly made overnight. Rebecca wore a dress that she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from a catalog, a deep ivory wool with small blue flowers embroidered along the cuffs and the collar, and she wore her dark hair up with 2 small combs that had been her mother's. And when Joel saw her walk through the door of the church on the arm of Tom Callahan, who had offered himself as the appropriate escort, and who was visibly moved by the occasion in a way he would have denied vigorously if asked, Joel understood with complete and terrible clarity why the poets had always sounded slightly unhinged when they tried to describe this particular kind of moment. She was beautiful, yes. She had always been beautiful, but it was not only that. It was the way she walked toward him with her chin up and her eyes steady and the faintest color in her cheeks from the cold and from whatever she was feeling, and it was the look on her face that said clearly, "I have decided you are worth this, and I am not afraid anymore." And the combination of all of it was something that exceeded the category of beauty and entered the category of revelation. He had worn the charcoal gray suit from Dodge City, and he had combed his hair and cleaned his boots and stood straight under Reverend Calkins's pine bough decoration. And he thought that nothing in his previous life had prepared him for the precise quality of the happiness he felt when she arrived beside him and looked up at him, and he saw that she was not only unafraid, she was glad. Reverend Calkins did give a long address, as Joel had predicted, on the subjects of providence and companionship, and it was not without merit, though Joel spent a portion of it looking at Rebecca beside him and cataloging the small details of her, the way she tucked one hand inside his elbow, the way she listened to the Reverend with polite attention, the curve of her profile against the white and pine bough green of the church interior. When the time came for the vows, Joel had written his own, which he had not told Rebecca he intended to do, and the look on her face when she realized it was not the standard wording was one he committed to permanent memory. "I promise you the truth of who I am," he said. "Not a version of it that has been made easier for the telling. I promise you that what you see is what is there, and that I will not keep anything from you out of the fear of seeming less than you hoped. I promise to come into this store every day for the rest of my life, and to deserve whatever it is you see when you look at me. And I promise that whatever comes next, the hard things and the easy things and everything in between, you will not face any of it alone." She was quiet for a moment after he finished, and he could see her holding something together behind her eyes with great effort. And then she said her own vows, the traditional ones because she had not known he was going to go off the text, and she gave them with a sincerity that made the traditional words sound as if they had been written specifically for this moment. The Callahan Ranch provided the beef, and Margaret Whitmore had organized a dinner in the church hall that was remarkable by the standards of a small Kansas town in December. And there was music from a fiddle player named Pete Saylor, who worked at the livery, and had a gift for the instrument that was entirely out of proportion to his general presentation. And the evening lasted long and warm, and full of the particular happiness of a community that has invested itself in the success of two of its members, and is watching the investment pay out. Joel danced with Rebecca, which he was not particularly skilled at, and she laughed at him without unkindness and showed him the basic step twice, and then let him manage it as best he could. And they danced together in the circle of the others in a way that was imperfect and entirely right. They moved into the house together that week, the small frame house at the edge of town that Joel had been renting from Tom Callahan for 2 years, and which Tom had sold to him at a reasonable price as a wedding gift of sorts, saying that a foreman ought to own the roof he lives under if he can manage it, and Joel had managed it. It was not a large house, but it was solid, and Rebecca looked it over with the eye of someone calculating what could be improved and what was already sufficient, and she made a small list in a notebook she kept in her apron pocket, and the making of the list was so characteristic of her that it made Joel smile in the doorway of the kitchen, watching her. "What are you smiling at?" she said without looking up. "Your list." "My list is practical and necessary." "It is," he agreed. "And it is also very much like you." She looked up at that and studied him for a moment, and then wrote something else in the notebook and tucked it back in her pocket. And he suspected he had just been added to the list, but could not confirm this without inspecting the notebook, and was not quite prepared to risk it. The first winter of their marriage was cold and settled and full of the particular domestic pleasures of two people who have been alone and capable for years, and who are discovering, with the slow surprise of the genuinely contented, that the ordinary things are more enjoyable when they are shared. The firewood that needed stacking, the morning coffee in the kitchen before the store opened, the evenings with the lamp lit and Rebecca's account ledger on the table and Joel's notes on the spring planting schedule beside it, two separate working lives running adjacent and occasionally intertwining, which was the shape of their life and which suited them both. He continued as foreman of the Callahan Ranch. She continued to run the store. They were both working people in a working country, and this was not a point of friction but a point of respect between them, because they were each too practical and too proud to pretend that either of their contributions was more or less essential than the other, and they had established from the beginning that the store's finances were hers to manage, and the ranch decisions were his to make, and the household was shared entirely. In March of 1883, Rebecca told Joel over the morning coffee that she was expecting their first child. She told him plainly, without ceremony, sitting across the kitchen table with her hands around her cup, and watched his face go through a series of things that did not immediately settle into a legible expression. "Say something," she said. "I am saying something internally," he said. "Give me a moment." She gave him a moment. The moment lasted perhaps 15 seconds, which was about 14 seconds longer than Rebecca's patience generally allowed for silent reflection, and then he put down his own cup and looked at her, and the expression on his face had settled into something she could read clearly, and what she read was a joy that was so large it had not yet found the correct container for itself. "I am going to be a father," he said. "That is the conclusion I had reached as well," she said. He came around the table and pulled her up out of her chair and held her against him with his arms around her and his chin on the top of her head, and he did not say anything else for a while, and she let him not say anything, because what he was communicating was coming through perfectly clearly without words. The news traveled through Harrow Creek with its customary speed and was received with the customary enthusiasm. Margaret Whitmore began a second quilt. Reverend Calkins said a particular prayer. Tom Callahan, when Joel told him, looked out across his ranch for a moment, and then said that a man ought to have something to work toward, and that a child was the finest such thing there was. Joel thought this was probably the most personal thing Callahan had ever said to him, and thanked him with the understanding of a man who knows when another man has given him something significant. The spring and summer of 1883 proceeded with the particular intensity of a frontier life that does not pause for private occasions. There were cattle to move and crops to tend, and a store to run, and Rebecca ran the store straight through August, which is when her presence behind the counter became a topic of some community discussion among the older women of Harrow Creek, who held a variety of opinions about how late into a pregnancy a woman ought to remain publicly employed. Rebecca held a single opinion on this subject, which was that she would determine when she was no longer comfortable behind her counter, and that the opinions of others on the matter were not, in the most respectful possible terms, her concern. Joel privately agreed with her entirely, and kept this private because he understood that expressing agreement with her on the matter in public would constitute a form of endorsement that might be construed as giving the discussion more weight than it deserved. He expressed his agreement at home, which Rebecca received with the satisfied air of a woman who has made her position clear to the most relevant audience. Their son was born in the first week of October, 1883, and Joel was there for it, which was not the custom for husbands at the time but which Rebecca had indicated clearly was not negotiable. He held her hand through most of it and said nothing useful and got in the way of the midwife, Mrs. Clara Hart, twice, and was firmly but kindly redirected on both occasions, and was standing against the bedroom wall when Mrs. Hart put a very new and loudly indignant small person into Rebecca's arms, and the sight of it hit him somewhere so deep and so fundamental that he understood it had rearranged something permanent inside him. "He is very loud," Joel said. "He is magnificent," Rebecca said, with the absolute authority of a woman who has just done the most significant physical work of her life, and is entitled to the final word on all related subjects. They named him Thomas for her father, and the choice was Joel's suggestion, which he had made privately the previous spring, and which he had offered to her with some uncertainty, not knowing if it would feel like the right thing or like a painful reminder of loss, and she had been quiet for a long moment, and then said yes, and the yes had carried so much in it that he had not pushed for words to explain it. Thomas Dalton grew with the unreasonable speed that babies seem to employ specifically to astonish their parents, and Harrow Creek received him, as it received all children born into families it had decided to claim, which was with an excess of attention and opinion, and a general collective investment in his upbringing that Rebecca managed with the same quiet authority she applied to everything else. The year of Thomas's infancy was the year Rebecca also made the decision to expand the store, which was a plan she had been developing in the back of her mind for the better part of 2 years, and which she put to Joel one evening in the spring of 1884 with the same practical directness she used for everything. "The property behind us is for sale," she said. "The Hargreaves lot. I want to buy it and extend the building. There is demand for a wider selection of dry goods and for a proper hardware section. Harrow Creek is growing. The store needs to grow with it." Joel looked at the numbers she had laid out on the table. She had already done the calculations. She had already identified the carpenter she wanted to use and estimated his costs. She had already projected the increased revenue against the expansion expense and determined the payback period. The plan was, in short, complete, and the presentation of it to him was not a request for permission, but a notification of intent combined with an invitation to contribute any relevant observations. He looked at the numbers for a while and then said, "You have underestimated the cost of the additional shelving." She looked at the numbers. "By how much?" "About 15%. Lumber prices have gone up since you made this estimate." "I was negotiating the ranch supply purchase last week and I know what the current prices are." She took the notebook back and adjusted the figures without comment and then looked at the revised total. "Still viable," she said. "Still viable," he agreed. "When are you planning to start?" "Late summer, after the busiest period. The work will take 6 weeks if we get good weather. You will need someone to manage the counter while the construction is happening. I have already spoken to Alice Hartwell. She worked at the general store in Abilene before she came here. She is capable." He leaned back and looked at her across the table with the warm and particular fondness of a man who has understood completely and finally the nature of who he has married. "You had already sorted all of this," he said. "I had the broad strokes," she said. "I needed the lumber prices corrected." He laughed, which was something he did more easily now than he had 3 years ago, and she smiled across the ledger at him. And Thomas Dalton, who was 8 months old and had no appreciation for business planning, made a conclusive sound from the direction of his cradle and demanded the return of someone's attention. The expansion went forward in the late summer of 1884 and was completed in October, and the new Kendrick General Store, as it continued to be called because it was Rebecca's store, and her name was the one on the sign and Joel had no objection to this whatsoever, was the largest commercial establishment in Harrow Creek, which had grown to a population of just under 300 souls and which was in the process of acquiring a second church, a school, and the kind of ambitious institutional energy that characterized frontier towns that have decided to become permanent. Joel's position at the Callahan Ranch evolved in the same years. Tom Callahan, who was past 60 and whose health had begun the kind of slow negotiation with time that men of his generation recognized, had begun in the early months of 1885 to include Joel in more of the ownership-level decisions of the ranch. Not transferring ownership, but preparing the ground for it, which Joel understood and which they discussed with the plain clarity of 2 practical men who respect each other. He was also, Joel, building his own modest stake in parallel. The house was owned. He had been saving steadily for 3 years, putting aside what he could from his salary in the account he kept at the Harrow Creek Bank. It was not a fortune, but it was the beginning of a foundation, and he thought about it the way he thought about the ranch, as something being built incrementally toward a future that was now, for the first time in his adult life, one he wanted to arrive at rather than one he was simply moving through. On the 3rd anniversary of their wedding, in December of 1885, he did something that he had been planning since the summer. He brought Rebecca to the empty lot on the east side of town, the one he had quietly purchased through the bank in October, and he showed her the architect's drawings he had commissioned from a man in Dodge City for a house. Not the small rented-and purchased frame house they were living in. A proper house. A 2-story house with a broad front porch and a kitchen large enough to work in comfortably, and a study and 4 bedrooms and a root cellar and a barn. A house designed for a family that intended to grow and for a life that intended to be long in one place. Rebecca stood in the cold December air with the drawings in her hands and did not say anything for a while. 4 bedrooms, she said finally. "We have 1 child," he said. "I thought we might have more." She looked at the drawings again. She pointed to the porch. "This faces west." "For the sunsets," he said. "You sit on the front step of the store in the evenings when you lock up and you always look west. I thought you might like a proper place to do it." She looked at him over the top of the drawings. The winter wind moved a strand of hair across her face, and she pushed it back. And in the late afternoon light on the third anniversary of their wedding, she was beautiful in the specific way that she had become more beautiful to him rather than less, which was one of the things about marriage that he had not anticipated, and that seemed to him to be among its most significant and unreported features. "Joel Dalton," she said, "you pay an extraordinary amount of attention." "I pay attention to you," he said. "That is different from paying attention generally." She put the drawings back in his hands and stepped forward and kissed him there in the empty lot in the December cold, with her hands against the front of his coat and her eyes closed, and the full intention of a woman who means everything she does, and he kissed her back with the same intention, and the plains stretched away from them in every direction under the wide and darkening winter sky. They broke ground on the house in the spring of 1886. Thomas was 2 years old and extremely interested in the construction and required constant supervision to prevent him from exploring the excavations for the root cellar, which was a job that occupied whoever was not otherwise occupied, and which he took as a personal challenge rather than a prohibition. He had his mother's directness and his father's stubbornness in roughly equal measure, which his parents found both exhausting and deeply amusing. In the summer of 1886, while the walls of the new house were going up and Thomas was learning to walk with the aggressive enthusiasm of someone who has just discovered locomotion, Rebecca discovered she was expecting a second child. She told Joel in the same way she had told him the first time, over the morning coffee across the kitchen table, and his reaction was slightly quicker this time, the containers for the large joy having been previously established, and he reached across the table and took her hand without requiring the 15 seconds of internal processing. "Good," he said simply. "Good," she agreed. The new house was finished in October of 1886, and they moved in during the first cold week of the month, carrying their household goods from the old frame house in the company of several ranch hands who had volunteered for the task with the cheerful energy of young men who appreciate any excuse to be useful in a way that also involves being able to talk about it later. Joel directed the operation with the organizational competence that had made him a good foreman, and Rebecca directed the interior placement of furniture with the organizational competence that had made her a good store owner, and the two systems of organization occasionally conflicted. But the conflicts were resolved with the negotiation of two people who have learned where each other's priorities actually live. Thomas investigated every room with solemn thoroughness and declared his bedroom to be acceptable. He had very recent but confident opinions about most things, which was both a trial and a delight. Their second child, a girl they named Margaret, for Margaret Whitmore, who had been a part of every significant occasion in their Harrow Creek life, was born in February of 1887. The February was bitter and the snow was deep, and Mrs. Hart arrived on horseback through conditions that she described as manageable, and that anyone else would have described as genuinely dangerous, and she delivered Margaret Dalton with the same brisk and capable authority she brought to everything, and went home in the same conditions without apparent concern, which was its own kind of remarkable. Margaret was quieter than Thomas from the beginning, a watchful and considering small person who studied the world before engaging with it, which struck both her parents as entirely familiar, and which made Joel think more than once that children are the most honest mirrors a person can be given. Harrow Creek continued to grow through the late 1880s. The second church was completed. The school opened in 1887, and Thomas Dalton was one of its first enrolled students, an occasion that Rebecca recorded in her notebook, and which Joel marked by arriving at the school on the first morning with Thomas on his shoulders, and setting him down at the door with a gravity that made the schoolteacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Evelyn Sparks, smile with some warmth. Thomas went in without looking back, which was very Thomas, and Joel stood outside the school for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before returning to the ranch. The railroad came through the area in 1888, not directly through Harrow Creek, but close enough that the town felt the effect of it, the new ease of supply and the new speed of connection with the broader world. And the store benefited from the additional available goods in a way that Rebecca had anticipated and planned for. Expanding her stock catalog and renegotiating several of her supplier relationships with the efficiency of someone who has been waiting for exactly this circumstance and has had the strategy prepared. Joel was given a partial ownership stake in the Callahan Ranch in the spring of 1888, which was Tom Callahan's way of ensuring that the future of what he had built was in the hands of the person he trusted most, and which Joel accepted with the understanding of a man who knows the full weight of what he is being given. Tom's health was declining in the slow way of old men who have worked their whole lives and given their bodies to the work and are running the account to its final balance. And Joel took on more of the full management without making it visible to Callahan in a way that would diminish him, which was a delicate and important piece of management of an entirely different kind. Tom Callahan died in the autumn of 1888. He died in his bed at the ranch in the October, with a simplicity and directness that was entirely in character with how he had lived. He left the ranch to Joel in its entirety, with a deed that had been drawn up by the lawyer in Dodge City the previous spring, and the bequest was accompanied by a letter in Callahan's careful hand that said, among other things, that he had known from the first year that Joel was the kind of man a ranch could trust, and that he hoped he would take care of the land with the same steadiness he brought to everything else. Joel read the letter alone in the study of the house on the east side of Harrow Creek, and sat with it for a long time in the quiet, and felt the grief of it genuinely and without reserve, which was something he had become more capable of since Rebecca, something he had not known he had lost and had not known she had given back to him until moments like this one made it clear. He told Rebecca about the bequest that evening, after Thomas and Margaret were in bed, and the house was quiet with the particular quality of quiet that comes after children are asleep, and she listened to all of it and then said, "He trusted you completely." Yes, that is not a thing he gave easily. He was not a man who gave things easily. No, Joel said, he was not. Then it means more for the difficulty of it, she said. He looked at her across the lamplit room. This woman who had known him for 6 years and who knew him as completely as he had ever been known by anyone, and felt the weight of the gratitude that he sometimes caught himself feeling for the accident of their meeting, for the January cold that had driven him into the store for oats, for the dry cloth in the rain in March, for the red dress in July, for the garnet ring on the counter, and for her absolute refusal to accept what was wrong and her absolute certainty that he was capable of getting it right. "I have been thinking about something," he said. "What kind of something?" "The kind that has been forming for a while." He paused. "I want to buy the land adjacent to the Callahan property, the Morris tract that has been sitting empty since the Morris family moved on in '86. I want to extend the operation, and I want to bring on 2 additional cowhands and develop the south section for the breeding program I have been thinking about for 2 years. She looked at him with the focused attention she gave to all business proposals, regardless of their personal relevance, and said, "Show me the numbers." He showed her the numbers. She went over them in her exact and careful way, cross-referencing with information she had stored in her remarkable memory about the current prices for cattle and land and labor in the region, and she made 3 observations, one of which identified an oversight in his cost projection that he immediately recognized as correct, and 2 of which were strategic suggestions that he had not considered and which were both good. "The timing is right," she said finally. "Do it." He did it. The Morris tract was purchased in the spring of 1889, and the breeding program began, and the Callahan Ranch, which in time took the name Dalton Ranch in the simple and practical way of property that has changed hands and wants the record to be clear, grew into one of the substantial ranching operations in the county over the following years. In the summer of 1889, their third child arrived, a second son they named William, who was from the beginning a child of extraordinary energy and volume, and who Thomas regarded with the benevolent despair of an older sibling who had enjoyed a period of relative calm and was now required to relinquish it, and Margaret regarded with the scientific interest of a person who has acquired a new subject for observation. William Dalton investigated the world with the cheerful aggression of someone who has decided in advance that all of it is interesting and none of it is to be feared, and kept both his parents in a state of informed alertness. Rebecca kept the store. She expanded it twice more over the following years, once in 1890 when the railroad connection made a wider stock catalog practical, and once in 1893 when the town had grown large enough that the demand justified it. The Kendrick General Store was, by the mid-1890s, the oldest and largest commercial establishment in Harrow Creek, a point of pride that Rebecca held with characteristic quiet competence rather than overt celebration. The store had been her father's dream, and then her inheritance, and then her own achievement, and she ran it with the same fundamental principle her father had given her when she was learning the business beside him as a girl. A store is not just a place where goods are exchanged. It is a place where people are taken care of. She held this principle through every expansion and every difficult season and every innovation in their supply chain, and it was the reason the people of Harrow Creek brought their business to her across 30 years of changing fortune, because they trusted her to know what they needed and to have it ready. Joel knew this about her as well as he knew anything. He knew it, and he was proud of it in the specific way. He was proud of the breeding program at the ranch, which was not demonstratively but completely, in the way that things you have watched be built and have had some part in supporting acquire a weight of meaning that goes beyond the thing itself. There was a morning in the summer of 1891, a Thursday in July, when the heat was extreme even by Kansas standards, and the plains shimmered in every direction, and the store smelled of hot pine and dry goods, and the particular dusty warmth of a midsummer mercantile. Rebecca was behind the counter when Joel came in, and she looked up from the ledger she had been consulting, and the expression on her face when she saw him was the same expression she had been giving him for 9 years now, the one that was somehow simultaneously entirely familiar and capable of doing the same thing to his chest that it had done the very first time. And he thought, standing in the doorway of her store in the July heat, that there was no adequate category for this kind of luck. He came to the counter and leaned on it and said, "There is something I have been meaning to ask you." She put her pen down with the slight attention sharpening that indicated she understood this was a real sentence and not the conversational warm-up to a supply order. "What is it? Do you regret it, any of it?" She studied him for a moment with those direct, dark eyes. "That is a strange question for a Tuesday morning. It is Thursday. Then it is an even stranger question for a Thursday morning." She tilted her head slightly. "Why are you asking?" "Because I think about it sometimes," he said. "What your life would have looked like if I had not come in for oats on that Tuesday in January. Whether it would have been larger or easier or more of what you wanted." "Joel." She came around the counter to stand next to him, the way she had come around the counter to stand next to him 9 years ago when he told her about Catherine, and she took his hand and held it with both of hers and looked up at him with the clear and unequivocal gaze of a woman who has thought about this very carefully and arrived at a firm conclusion. "I had a store and a life and a very good plan. And then I had all of that, and also you, and also Thomas and Margaret and William. There is no version of the arithmetic that produces a better outcome than the one I am living in." He looked at her. He looked at the ring on her finger, the garnet, which she had worn every day for 9 years without removing it, except for the one occasion when Thomas, aged 3, had tugged it off her finger with the concentrated strength of a small person who wants a small, shiny object, and she had retrieved it within the minute from his closed fist and put it back on with the decisiveness of someone reclaiming something essential. "I am not sorry either," he said, in case it was in question. "It was not in question," she said, "but I appreciate you confirming it." She went back around the counter and picked up her pen and returned to the ledger, and he watched her for a moment and then went back to the ranch, and the ordinary Thursday continued in its ordinary way, which was exactly right. The years that followed brought the ordinary variety of frontier life, the good seasons and the hard ones, the years of plentiful rain and the years when the plains dried, and the cattle needed moving to find sufficient grass, and the store's credit arrangements with its suppliers required careful management, because the whole territory was tight. They navigated these things together, not always without friction, because two capable and opinionated people living and working in parallel proximity do not navigate entirely without friction, but with the fundamental alignment of two people who have made the same choice and intend to honor it, and who trust each other at the level where trust actually matters. Thomas grew into a serious and capable young man who showed from early in his teens an aptitude for the ranch work that made Joel think, with a careful and deliberate joy, that the operation he had built might have a future beyond himself. Thomas was not a copy of his father. He had his mother's precision and her gift for numbers, which he applied to cattle management in ways that surprised and pleased Joel, who had always done the ranch by instinct and experience, and who found it illuminating to see the same decisions framed in Thomas's more analytical terms. Margaret grew into a young woman with her mother's quiet authority and her father's patience, and she had a gift for medicine that manifested early. In the careful way she tended injured animals on the ranch, and the systematic way she read the medical reference books that were among the stock at the store. In 1900, when she was 13, Rebecca ordered a comprehensive medical text from a publisher in St. Louis as part of her regular catalog expansion, and when it arrived, Margaret read it cover to cover within a week, and then went back and read it again with a notebook beside her, which was the kind of thing that told you something definitive about a person's direction. William remained, through his childhood and into his adolescence, a person of robust energy and cheerful impracticality, which worried Joel for approximately 2 years, and then stopped worrying him when he realized that William's cheerful impracticality was actually a front for a deep and genuine love of the land, not the technical management of it but the land itself, the creek and the grass and the particular quality of the sky over the Kansas plains at every hour of the day, and that he was going to be the kind of person who held things as beautiful that other people simply used, and that the world needed those people as much as it needed any other kind. In 1895, Joel's 33rd year of life and the 13th year of their marriage, Rebecca was diagnosed with a lung ailment that presented that winter as a persistent and worsening cough that Dr. Fielding, who had come to Harrow Creek in 1892, identified after examination as the early stages of a condition that would require care and attention and the specific avoidance of cold and dust. This was not what either of them wanted to hear. Rebecca received the diagnosis with the same composed and analytical attention she gave to the bad figures in a difficult trading season, which is to say, she took it in and looked at it directly and identified what was actionable about it, and made a plan for the actionable parts. Joel received the diagnosis privately, in the barn after he left the doctor's office, with considerably less composure, and spent 20 minutes in the cold company of his horses, working through the full fear of it before bringing himself to the contained state appropriate for the conversation he needed to have with Rebecca. She was ahead of him when he arrived home. She had the medical reference book open on the kitchen table and a list in her notebook and a cup of tea going on the stove. "Sit down," she said. He sat down. "The doctor says it is early and manageable," she said. "The things that make it worse are cold air, dust, and overwork. I am going to hire Alice Hartwell full-time at the store. She has been wanting the hours. I am going to stop going into the back room myself and let her handle the heavy stock. I am going to keep the stove in the store well fueled in winter, and I am going to take the doctor's preparations exactly as prescribed." She looked at him. "I am also going to be fine." "I know you are going to be fine," he said. "But I would like 1 minute to be afraid before I agree to be optimistic." She put her notebook down. She looked at him with the full attention of a woman who understands that the person across from her is frightened in a way that has roots deeper than the present moment. He had lost Catherine to illness. She knew this. She had known it for 13 years, and she understood it now in its full implication. "1 minute," she said quietly. "Take whatever you need." He did not cry. He was not a man who cried easily. But he sat at the kitchen table for the full minute she had given him, and he felt the fear with complete honesty, the specific fear of losing what you cannot afford to lose, the fear that knows its own precedent and does not need to be told what it costs. And then he breathed and looked at her, and she was there, solid and present and planning and absolutely herself. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you need from me." "I need you to not manage me," she said. "I need you to trust that I know my own body and my own limits. I need you to be there when I want you there, and to understand when I need to handle something myself." "Those are reasonable requirements," he said. "They are the same requirements I have always had," she said. "They have not changed because of this." She was right that it was early and manageable, and she was right that she was going to be fine, because she applied to her own recovery the same systematic intelligence she applied to everything. And she took the doctor's preparations, and she hired Alice Hartwell, and she stopped lifting the heavy stock herself, and she burned good fuel in the store stove through the winter and the following winter. And by the spring of 1897, 2 years after the diagnosis, Dr. Fielding declared the condition significantly improved, and he credited her management of it, which Rebecca received with the mild satisfaction of someone whose method has been confirmed by results. Joel had been, throughout those 2 years, precisely what she had asked him to be, which was there when she wanted him and trusting of her judgment when she needed to manage herself. It had been the harder assignment of the 2 options, being present without overriding, and he had not managed it perfectly. There had been winter mornings when the cold was particularly sharp, and he had said more than she needed to hear about whether she ought to open the store at all, and she had told him plainly to stop, and he had stopped, and they had moved forward without the incident becoming more than it was. This was the ordinary maintenance of a long and close marriage, the small recurring negotiations of 2 strong-willed people who respect each other and are not, and do not pretend to be, without the friction of distinct and confident personalities. By the turn of the century, 1900, Harrow Creek had become a town of genuine size, and the Dalton Ranch was one of the established operations of the county. Thomas was 16 and working the ranch after school. Margaret was 13 and reading medical texts. William was 11 and capable of naming every plant species in the creek bottom, and the reasons each one grew where it did, which no one had taught him. Rebecca ran the store, and her lung condition was, per Dr. Fielding's last examination, effectively resolved, and Joel was 50 years old and looked at the life he was living, and could not find a single thing in it that he would have chosen to put back. He said this to Rebecca one October evening in 1900, on the broad front porch of the house on the east side of Harrow Creek, the one he had built for her with the porch facing west for the sunsets, and they were sitting in the 2 wooden chairs that lived on that porch through every season except the deepest winter, and the sky over the Kansas plains was doing the thing it always did in October at the end of the day, building itself into those impossible layered shades of gold and copper and rose that made the whole flat country look briefly and extravagantly magnificent. "I was thinking today," he said, "about the ring on the counter." She looked at him sideways. "You were thinking about making a fool of yourself." "I was thinking about how close I came to getting it entirely wrong," he said. "If you had said yes to the first one, to the 'I reckon we ought to,' you would never have known I was disappointed," she said. I would have made the best of it. I know, that is what I was thinking about." He paused. "I am glad you told me I was doing it wrong." "I am glad you tried again," she said. The sun was going down in its theatrical way, pulling all the color with it toward the horizon, and the air was the clean, sharp October air of the plains. And the house behind them held 3 children who were becoming people in the particular and astonishing way of children in good houses. And the town they had helped to build spread out in every direction from their porch, and the ranch lay to the west under the extravagant sky. And Joel Dalton looked at all of it and looked at Rebecca beside him in her chair, and thought about the ring on the counter, and the ring on her finger, and the dry cloth in the rain and every Friday afternoon, and the charcoal gray suit in Dodge City, and the one knee on the floorboards, and the word yes. "Rebecca," he said. She turned to look at him. "I would marry you again tomorrow," he said, "under the same terms, with the same result." She was quiet for a moment. The sky was going deeper colors now, the rose tipping toward red. "Under better terms," she said. "I would make the house larger." "The house is plenty large," he said. "I mean the porch," she said. "I would make the porch larger." He looked at the porch. It was a reasonable porch. He saw immediately what she meant. "Next spring," he said, "we can extend it." "On the south side," she said, "to catch the afternoon light." "On the south side," he agreed. She turned back to the sunset. He watched her profile against the October sky, the way it had been his particular habit to watch her face against the light for 18 years. And he thought that this, the ordinary late evening of an ordinary October day, was perhaps the truest and most complete thing he had ever been part of. And he held it with the careful attention of a man who knows the value of what he has because he knows exactly what it cost to get here, and what it would mean to lose it. He had never proposed to anyone in his life before Rebecca Kendrick. He had held a ring in his hand and said the wrong words, and she had sent him away to do better. He had done better. And the better had been building itself, in the quiet and steady way of things that are built to last, for 18 years on the flat and beautiful ground of Harrow Creek, Kansas. The porch extension went in the following spring, exactly as agreed, with Thomas managing the carpentry and Joel assisting, and William underfoot offering observations about the structural properties of the wood that were mostly accurate and completely unrequested. It turned out that south side afternoon light was in fact an excellent thing, and Rebecca sat in it on spring mornings with her coffee and her ledger, and looked over the town that spread out from her house in every direction, and felt, in the deep and private way of a woman who has made her life with her own hands and her own choices, entirely and completely at home. Margaret, as she had been quietly determined to do since the age of 13, eventually studied medicine, corresponding with Dr. Fielding through her teen years, and then, in 1907, traveling to Kansas City to train under a physician who accepted women students, which was still a rarity but was no longer an impossibility. And she returned to Harrow Creek in 1911 to practice alongside Dr. Fielding, who was himself aging, and who received her return with something that was unmistakably relief, combined with the pride of a man who has watched someone become exactly what they were supposed to become. Thomas took on the primary management of the Dalton Ranch in the same years, and he was by this point exactly the kind of manager his father had been, which is to say practical and reliable, and earning the trust of the men who worked for him without needing to make a performance of it. The analytical gift, the one he had gotten from his mother, made him a better rancher than Joel had been in some technical respects, a fact that Joel acknowledged with the complete absence of ego that is available only to people who are genuinely secure in who they are. William took up surveying, of all the unexpected things, a profession that allowed him to spend his working life on the land itself, measuring and recording and understanding the physical reality of the country he loved, and he was good at it, and he was, of everyone, the most likely to arrive at the house on a Sunday with some extraordinary observation about the sky or the creek, or the particular red of the autumn grass that he delivered as simple fact, and which landed on everyone present as the kind of thing you needed a moment to absorb. The Kendrick General Store, in the end, was sold in 1915, when Rebecca was 59 and Joel was 63, and they had been married for 33 years. And the selling of it was Rebecca's own choice and her own timing, made when she was satisfied that Alice Hartwell's niece, who had been working the counter for 4 years, understood the store's fundamental purpose and would carry it forward correctly. The woman who bought it, young Martha Hartwell, was 28 and practical and kind and attentive to what her customers needed, and Rebecca looked at her on the morning of the sale across the very counter on which a garnet ring had once been placed and retrieved and placed on a different finger, and she thought that her father would have approved of Martha Hartwell. And she signed the deed with a steady hand and walked out into the Harrow Creek morning with 34 years of the store's history carried quietly inside her, and she did not look back. Joel was waiting outside with the wagon. He had known better than to wait inside. She climbed up beside him, and he took her hand, and they drove home through the town that had grown up around them over 34 years, past the church and the bank and the school where Thomas and Margaret and William had learned their first letters, past the site of the old Whitmore house, Margaret long since gone, the building now a proper hotel of considerable ambition, past the streets that had been raw dirt in 1882 and were now properly graded and familiar, and up to the house on the east side with its extended south porch, which had been extended again in 1908 to accommodate a second swing, and which in October still caught the sunset light in all its copper and rose extravagance. They had grandchildren by then. Thomas had married in 1906 and had 2 boys of his own, loud and fleet-footed creatures named James and Samuel, who regarded the extended porch as a personal racetrack, and were permitted certain liberties by their grandparents that their father monitored with the resigned affection of a man who understands that the rules of his own childhood have been revised for the next generation. Margaret had not married, by her own choice and without apparent regret, which Rebecca respected completely and Joel respected because Rebecca did. She came to dinner on Sundays, and she argued cheerfully with everyone about medicine, and about politics, and about the suffrage movement, which she supported with a passionate conviction that she had carried since she was a girl, and which made Joel think of Rebecca in 1882 refusing to be proposed to like a land deal, and think that there was something about the women in his life and their absolute certainty about the value of what they deserved. William had married a surveyor's assistant named Clara Booth in 1912, a small and fierce woman from Colorado who shared his capacity for looking at the landscape as something beautiful rather than just something useful. And they had a daughter in 1914 named Ruth who, by the reports Joel had received, already had strong opinions about the correct way to do most things, which boded well for the overall standard of the family. So on the afternoon of the day Rebecca sold the store, they sat on the south side of the extended porch in the October light, and the Kansas plains spread out from them in every direction under the same sky they had been watching together for 33 years, and the town beyond the yard was living its ordinary Thursday afternoon life with the comfortable noise of a community that has settled into itself, and the house behind them held the accumulated evidence of a life built deliberately and with care. "How do you feel?" Joel asked. She considered this seriously as she always considered direct questions seriously. "Like something has been set down," she said. "Not lost, set down." "That is the right way to feel about it." "I believe it is." She leaned back in her chair. "The store will be well cared for." "Yes, Martha Hartwell is exactly the right kind of person for it. She is. My father would have agreed. He would have." She was quiet for a moment, watching the light on the grass. "Joel, yes. Do you remember the first thing you said to me, the very first time you came in?" He thought. He remembered it clearly, which was one of the properties of a memory that has been looked at often over 33 years and has become worn smooth with it, the way a river stone becomes smooth, the edges gone but the shape intact. "I asked for a 50-pound sack of oats," he said, "and you heaved it up onto the counter without asking for help." "You were going to offer," she said. "I was," he said. "You were faster." "I had been managing the back shelves alone for a year at that point," she said. "I had the method down. I know, I watched you do it. I thought you were the most capable person I had ever met." She looked at him sideways. "From a sack of oats." "From a sack of oats," he confirmed. "And the way you carried it. And the way you looked at me when you turned around, like you were assessing the territory." "I was," she said. "I was always assessing." "I know, I did not mind being assessed." "No," she said. "I noticed that you did not." The October sun was moving toward the horizon in its deliberate way, and the light on the porch was becoming the particular warm gold of late afternoon, and she reached across and took his hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, the way she had done on the counter of the store 33 years ago when she had closed his fingers around the ring and held them and told him to try again. He turned his hand over and held hers. He had been holding her hand for 33 years, and it still felt like something you chose rather than something that was simply there. "That was the right call," he said, "making me try again." "It was," she said. "You did very well the second time. Better than the first time. Immeasurably. Good." He looked at the sunset. "I think I would do better still a third time if the occasion arose." She looked at him with the expression that had been specific to him for 33 years, the one that held all the assessment and the warmth and the directness and the history of them together, and she said, "There is no occasion. You are already married to me." "I know," he said. "I am making a point about improvement." "Your point is noted," she said, "and dismissed as unnecessary." He laughed. He had been laughing more easily for 33 years than he had for the 30 before them. And this particular laugh, the one she drew out of him with the dry precision of her wit, was one of his favorite sounds in his own life, which was a strange thing to know about yourself, but entirely true. The sun went down over the Kansas plains the way it always did, without reference to the significance of what was happening on any given porch in any given town, in spectacular and democratic and gorgeous indifference. The copper and the rose and the deep red spread across the western sky, and then faded into the blue that comes after sunset, and then into the deep and star-filled dark of the plains at night, which was its own kind of beautiful. They sat until the last of the light was gone, and then they went inside, into the lamplit kitchen that smelled of the evening meal and the familiar domestic history of a house that has been fully lived in, and they closed the door on the October night. And the house held them in its 4-bedroom, broad-porched, root-cellared solidity, and the town spread out beyond the windows in its Thursday evening ordinariness. And the ranch lay to the west under the stars, and Harrow Creek, Kansas, in the year 1915, continued its settled and permanent life around the quiet and the complete, and the entirely resolved story of two people who had been, in the end, exactly what the other one needed, which is the best and simplest thing that can be said about any two people who have found each other and had the sense to hold on.